So, good afternoon. My name is Henk Mulder. I work for the International Air Transport Association. I'm the head of digital cargo there. Firstly, my apologies for not being able to be attending the conference in person. I had been looking forward to that, but unfortunately, my organization still has a travel ban, so I cannot actually travel. I'll be talking about the next milestone in digitalization of air cargo. And in fact, I'll be making some remarks, and Andre Simma after me will make its own introduction, and then the two of us will have a chat about what's going on in the different modes and what we can learn from each other. So without further ado, let's get into it. Quick introduction of air freight. As you can see from the graph on the left, we had a big dip in performance last year. We were operating at the peak at about 22 billion CTKs, cargo ton kilometers per month. That dropped to a very low level. It went from 22 to 15. The zero line is not the zero here. And we've recovered most of that. In fact, we're past the pre-COVID level. E-commerce has increased enormously and carries about 20% of the overall air freight now. If I just compare this to the passenger transport, which is we sort of normalized it here to 100%. What you can see is cargo on top is doing better than before, whereas the international passenger travel, which is the curve at the bottom, is barely above zero. It's still a very, very bad time for airlines. And in fact, it's the cargo transport now that is keeping the airlines flying, which actually is a very fortunate situation, because previously airlines didn't care that much about cargo. They made all the money, or most of the money, from the passenger transport. So that's different now, and we don't think that will change. We think it will remain a very important source for the airlines. Quickly about our fleet. It's about 5,000 airlines in the world, but only about 400, which are our members, represent 95% of all transport. Okay, so that gives you an impression. 30,000 aircraft flying around, which will double in the next 20 years. Most aircraft are, in fact, passenger aircraft that carry cargo in the belly. And only about 7% of that fleet are freighters, dedicated freighters for cargo only. During the pandemic, because there was such a lack of passenger aircraft, we couldn't carry cargo because the bellies weren't flying, if you will. And so a lot of airlines have converted passenger aircraft into what we call freighters, which allows them to carry, they took the seats out, if you want, and they can now carry some type of cargo, not all cargo, in the passenger cabin. What is cargo for? Air cargo, it's things like consumer electronics, perishable goods, pharma products a lot as well, artwork like expensive stuff, valuables I mentioned, diamonds. The next time you fly, you may be sitting on top of a stash of diamonds, so get ready for that. If you travel with pets, they also go as cargo. COVID-19 kind of changed the whole game, also in the type of cargo that we carried. So initially it was all the PE equipment, and now last year, since the vaccines were available, we anticipate that they're having to transport about 16 billion doses to save I don't know how many millions of lives. Distribution would be over a 2-year period. This was where we planned it, and we actually put together a whole guidance document on how you do that, not just for the aircraft, for the airlines, but for the entire supply chain. Turns out that we did a good job, we as in the industry, not IATA, but the industry. And transport is not the bottleneck for the vaccines. The bottleneck currently is the manufacturing, because making vaccines is not that easy. You can't just increase the output. Air transport is very similar to maritime transport when you look at the actual process, as you can see on the top there. Warehouse, forwarder, customs, ground handlers, we call them. I think you call them stevedores. Air carrier then transports the stuff, and then on the other side, the whole thing happens in reverse. Our airports have some facilities that you'll recognize as well: dangerous goods, security, cool storage, live animal storage, lots of stuff, valuable storage, safes and things like that. Okay, and then we're regulated by ICAO as opposed to the IMO, which is your regulator, and IATA itself is also doing a lot of work in that area. So we did a SWOT analysis of air cargo, and there's a few things that sort of stand out. This is an analysis we did with the shippers, right? Not ourselves. we asked the shippers, why do you use air cargo? What is the good things? What are the strengths, weaknesses, and threats? And this is what they came up with. There's a lot of stuff there, but some of them sort of jump out. The number one strength they refer to is speed, but also reliability, safety, and security, which is natural in a sense because, aircraft have to be safe and secure. The other thing is that once the aircraft takes off, there's nothing that can come out, right? So during the entire journey, things are secure by definition. Lots of opportunities, in particular e-commerce. At the time when we did this survey, there was a lot of talk about drones as well. It's a bit less now, but it's still an active thing, because when we talk about drones, we don't talk about the little toy things that you use to film yourself skiing or something. We talk about drones the size of a proper aircraft that can actually carry freight, but without a pilot. Weaknesses, interestingly enough, slow adoption of new technology. I could tell you everything about that. Also some complaints about overcapacity at that time. Right now, that's not an issue because there's a serious undercapacity, which is why the freight rates are so high. Threats, they mentioned things like in-flight fires and terrorism. And indeed, in-flight fires are a big concern in the cargo world, air cargo world, in particular the transport of non-declared lithium batteries. Okay, that's always that's one of our big worries about manufacturers shipping batteries that are not of the right quality and that don't declare them, so we can't even intercept them. So that's a big problem. Quickly, So the process of, if you want, the data exchange technologies, how they have evolved over time is shown on this graph here. We started with paper it's actually long before the 80s, but I had to put a timeline on. So let's say paper in the 80s was paper, year 2000 was electronic document interchange using cargo community systems or CCSs. Right now we're in the API era, so we have standards for APIs, and we pursue what we call the Internet of Logistics, where various parties like airlines, forwarders, customs, e-commerce can exchange data directly without the need for an intermediary. And all of this is heading towards something that is called data spaces, let's say in 10 years from now, where all parts of the economy will be managed through data, and we won't worry so much about how you get the data. We'll sort that out. We'll have sorted it out by then. But really about what can you do with the data, who owns it, can you buy it, can you sell it, who's responsible, all of those questions. And so IATA has had programs in all of these areas, and still, of course, going forward, still have all of these programs there. One of the biggest challenges that we are facing in air cargo at IATA is that when we develop a new standard based on some new technology, it can easily take 20 years for that to be adopted. For example, the e-airway bill that we have, which is very similar to your e-bill of lading, is we started our program before the year 2000, right? 1999, we had some meetings around that, and it took us like almost 10 years to really see that work. A lot of problems around government's acceptance, for example, and also within the company's acceptance of these technologies and the need to change the legacy which was in place then. And then it took another 10 years almost to go from 0 to where we are now, 75. We anticipate that we'll have 100% usage of e-airway bills by the end of 2022, which is the end of next year, so it's not so bad. But it will take us 20 years. And so the point here is that if you want to develop standards that you want to see active in the year 2030, you have to start a decade or two before that, right? Otherwise, you'll never get there. So that's one of the constraints, at least at the moment. I'm hopeful that going forward, this will change, that we'll get more and more used to using new technologies, and it will be faster in adoption. But certainly, historically, that's not the case. Just a quick introduction of One Record. One Record is our sort of standard for data sharing and what we call the Internet of Logistics, right? Now, what does that mean? What did we actually develop and how did we do that? The first thing that we did was develop a new data model. We started from scratch. We of course learned from all of the data models we had before in the previous era, but we literally took a blank sheet and said, okay, what do we need now? Okay. We then developed an API to go with that, a very beautiful and sophisticated API. We developed standards for data security, and then we started really the whole process of working on adoption. So, for example, we created events around the One Record project. We engaged with the stakeholders, where they are the airlines or the forwarders or the IT solution providers. We involved them all. We set up a governance structure for how to manage the development, but also the maintenance of these new standards. We came up with lots of use cases where data sharing would be a good idea. We organized hackathons, which are brilliant events where we get together a whole bunch of developers for a whole weekend, and they work through the night, and so they start on Saturday, and on Sunday they come out with truly innovative apps. And in some cases, those apps have led to new companies, to startups, or to new products for existing companies. Exciting stuff. We are continually refining the standards. We have done a lot of work on documentation. It's all online. In fact, it's an open standard, so anybody can use this. You can go to our website now and download it all and have your own One Record server up and running before this conference is over. We are running pilots with companies. I think at the moment we must have about 60, 70 companies involved in that are testing all the aspects of this particular standard. We've focused on communications, including participating in events like this. We developed really cool tools. We have a very nice developer portal. We have engaged in partnerships. We plan to develop some products. They were actually working on developing products around the standards. We're planning to deploy some training programs and consulting opportunities. We'll continue to enhance the standard, and we will be aiming sort of our next big thing is how to get this adopted by all of the airlines and by all of the forwarders. So that is One Record in a nutshell. I think one thing that I think is particularly relevant at this conference is that I know that you have just developed the EBL. And so, of course, when you do that, you'd like to think that within a matter of a year or 2 or 3, the entire maritime industry has adopted that. And I hope that's the case. But it won't just happen. You'll have to really drive that. And so I want to share some of the things that we did to drive the adoption of our e-airway bill. Number one, communication and collaboration. Very important. You have to work with the stakeholders. They have to be involved in the development, and they have to be part of your governance. The next one, this is not in order, but the next one on my list here is commercialization. We actually commercialize our standards, partly because we have to earn a living, right? Somebody has to pay my salary. But actually, what we have found is when you create events and you create publications, consulting, training, and products, these really, really help the deployment of your standards, because it allows your stakeholders, your customers, your shipping companies to implement your standard with great tools and great training and with support from publications and consulting, right? So it's actually a really important thing to do. Sometimes you can enforce the use of new standards. It's not always legal, so you need to be careful that you only do it when it's legal. I have seen companies, for example, putting penalties on shipments that came with paper rather than electronic airway bills. I wouldn't say it's been a huge success yet, but okay, it can work. I've seen areas where it does work. One of the most important things is to work with your IT solution providers. They can help you. They can influence your standards in a positive way. They get first mover advantage. And what is great for us is that since probably 95% of all of our customers, if you're on all of the airlines and forwarders, use IT solution providers for their IT shop. If you work with their providers, you automatically get those companies with you. So that really multiplies adoption. That's an absolute key there. You need to be a bit careful in your partnerships because there is money involved, and you don't want to end up, being left out of your own commercial program. So it's a bit of a balance there. Education, you need to set up education programs, which is good for you too, because you learn from it. And also, frankly, when you're expecting millions of companies to implement your standard, there's no way you're going to be briefing them one-on-one. Lobbying is important. You need to influence the decision makers, the strategists, and people like that. And funnily enough, if you repeat the story often enough, it sort of becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So you do need a lot of lobbying and a lot of talking about it. And the last one I already mentioned, hackathons. They're really awesome events. And I know that at our next hackathon, the One Record Hackathon, some of our friends from MSC and DCSA will be there with some challenges. So you'll be hearing about that going. A couple of more slides. If I just focus on the digitalization drivers, or in other words, why we do this, right? Now, there are a few here. So one of them is global shocks. The pandemic, at least in the air transport world, really change how companies interact and how they do business together. Because basically, we lost virtually all capacity. And so somehow people had to fix that. Okay, so it changed the way they did business. It changed all of their forward contracts, right? Because they couldn't deliver. So we were forced to sort of accelerate the way that we are agile. And that in itself has accelerated digitalization, which is good news. I mentioned e-commerce as a big thing in the airline business. And if you're not careful, then e-commerce can do your job. Amazon, Alibaba, they can buy airplanes. In fact, they have bought airplanes. Amazon even has an airport. In fact, most of these e-commerce providers more or less have their own hubs. But you can also work with them. And so I always say, as long as the air transport business is able to fulfill the service level agreements that the e-commerce have with their customers, which is people like you and me, like, the 12-hour, 24-hour, 36, 72, etc. As long as we can help them deliver that, they'll be fine. But if we don't help them with that, they will do it themselves. Okay. Next driver is the fact that our society is digitalized, the fact that we have lots of digital natives that know nothing else but digital tools, like their phones. But the workplace isn't fully digitalized yet, and we're getting there. This whole teleworking thing that we've all been through has actually been a tremendous push for digitalizing the working place. So that's a good thing. Then there's the big one, growth and globalization. We have 8 billion people on the planet, give or take. And for the time being, that's still growing. Okay, so you cannot have such a global population without depending on each other. And if you depend on each other, it means that there's always going to be need for intercontinental transport of all types, including maritime, of course. But when it comes to digitalization, I think that we have two choices. We can either take the cost now and invest in our systems and get ready for that growth that is permanently taking place, or we cannot. But if we don't do it now, then we will pay the price in the future, and that price may well be going out of business. So you can either take the cost now, or you're going to have what we call the opportunity cost because you haven't done it, right? And you'll pay the price for that. Maybe to summarize, right now our focus is on IATA One Record data sharing standard. With that, we're pushing what we call the Internet of Logistics, a direct interchange between the all companies, the ability for them to sort of plug into each other, to exchange data with ease. And then all of this will be leading towards data spaces in perhaps a decade from now. It's extremely exciting stuff, okay? I want to finish with a couple of quotes. First one is from Tim Berners-Lee, who invented the World Wide Web back in, I think it was 1991, yes. He said this just a few years ago, in 2019, I think. The web as I envisage it, we have not seen yet. Can you imagine that? Okay. He thought about that 30 years ago now. The web as I envisage it, we have not seen yet. The future is still so much bigger than the past. And the next quote is from Ira Jacobson. He's the co-developer of the Unified Modeling Language and the Rational Unified Process, which are both building blocks and foundations of modern software engineering. So he said, in fact, I attended a conference when he said this. How do you think I can be so sure about predicting the future? And he answered himself. He said, because I'm going to make sure it happens like that. And you put these two together, and I think what it tells us is that we really need to work together, believe in that digitalized transport environment that we're envisaging, and then we have to do it. And if we do, it will be just like that. So with that, to stop my presentation and leave the floor to Andre. Many thanks.